It's the Draft Fellows coming at you live. Kyle and Andrew breaking down the drive. Prospects to roster, we got the flow. First round picks to the ones you don't know. Talk about the combine, skills on display. Who's rising up and who's falling away. Roster building like a GM in the zone. Kyle, Fellows, Andrew Mertig, they own the phone.
Hey, welcome back to the Draft Fellows podcast. I'm Andrew Mertig. That is Kyle Fellows. And together we are the Draft Fellows. Make sure you're following us on YouTube. Or, of course, you can check out the audio version on your favorite podcasting platform. Also, just so you know, we do have a Twitter account that you can follow. And we also just launched our Blue Sky account. So wherever you are on social media, make sure you check that out. But Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It is kind of hard to believe, honestly, that we are halfway through the NFL season. We've got NFL Week 11 over halfway, right? And we're halfway through the month of November. So it feels like this fall is just kind of flying by. Football, the season is flying by, but it's been a lot of fun things to talk about. But how are you doing?
Yeah, it's been really a blur. Like this whole fall has felt really accelerated. Just like you said, hard to believe we're already in week 11. This is like when you're playing fantasy football. This is the critical time, and of course, it seems like all of the best players have bye weeks in this like 2 to 3 week stretch. So that's fun to navigate. Just so much going on, and really like as you were jockeying for playoff position in fantasy football, the real life NFL teams are starting to jockey for playoff position, and things are getting very interesting. We're coming off of a fascinating week 11.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not a fantasy football podcast. People don't tune in to listen to us talk about that. But last week, man, like the bye week, there were so many openings. Like usually I feel like I do a good job of managing my roster and having guys to plug in. Last week I had a roster where I was starting Tyler Conklin and Hunter Henry in the flex, and then the backup running back for New England, who's escaping me right now, that used to be in Washington.
Jermichael Hasty?
No, he's oh man, he used to be the Washington Commanders. Antonio Gibson.
Oh, Antonio Gibson.
Yeah. I had to start Antonio Gibson as a starting running back as well. So rough week, but we're getting down the stretch there as well, and we'll get to those playoffs very soon as well. So good luck in your fantasy leagues if you play. But obviously, Andrew and I love the NFL draft. That's what the show is all about. But in a broader sense, we just love talking about roster building because there are just so many ways to go about building and rebuilding NFL rosters. And managing sports personnel in general is just a really fascinating conversation. And so today we're kind of taking a break from talking rookies and talking 2025 prospects to have a roster building conversation with one team specifically in mind. We want to talk about the New Orleans Saints a little bit because there's been a lot of things happening with this NFC South organization, and there are equally as many questions surrounding the future direction of the team's roster and their financial and salary cap situations in general. So we are here this week to talk about the Saints and to really discuss their options going forward. And so much of this conversation is financial. So there are a lot of details here. So Andrew, why don't you just jump in, set this up for us, and tell us what the Saints are looking at as they go into their future?
Yeah, so we've known for a while this is going to be a really interesting offseason for the Saints. It seemingly every offseason is really interesting for the Saints because they have navigated the salary cap in a different way, or at least a more extreme way, by consistently redoing their players' contracts and pushing this money further and further out. They get into a little bit more trouble every offseason, and it's basically paying off your credit cards with more credit cards. And eventually that bill is going to come due. So I wanted to see like just how bad is this getting? Because I feel like for the last 3 or 4 off seasons, we've said, okay, how are the Saints ever going to get out of this? Then you take a little bit closer look and like, okay, they can do this. But also we see this roster getting weaker and weaker every offseason. So, in the last couple of weeks, we saw Dennis Allen get fired. On the surface, this is a pretty talented roster, but they face so many challenges this upcoming offseason. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at how they could possibly dig themselves out from an approximately $77 million hole for 2025. That is after the Marshawn Lattimore trade. So when I make these recommendations, I'm not factoring in post-June 1st cuts because they have to get under the cap before the start of the league year. So post-June 1st cuts don't really help them out when we're factoring in what they can do. So we're going to start with a laundry list of doing things that the Saints don't really like to do, and that is cutting players. And so I would start out and take a look at offensive tackle Ryan Ramczyk, who was one of the best tackles in the entire league, but has been dealing with injury problems. We don't know what his future is going to look like. I think the Saints probably do need to take a look at moving on from him. Somebody like Jamal Williams, tight end Foster Moreau, Cedric Wilson, linebacker DeMarco Jackson, those players together would save $15.7 million. So that's not a huge amount, right, when you're looking at cutting players, but that is a place to get started. Now, the big one, and this is restructuring money. And this is the move they almost have to do. There's no way around it. And that is restructuring Derek Carr, which is going to save them $30.1 million. And that would then put them at negative $31.2 million on the cap. The problem with doing this is you're just pushing this damage out further and further and further. So you're locking yourself into Derek Carr, who, yes, played really well for the first 2 weeks, then didn't play very well. And his tenure in New Orleans has been rocky at best. And I don't know that this is a quarterback you want to tie yourself to long term, especially given where the record is and the possibility that they could be looking at maybe Spencer Rattler becomes your quarterback of the future as an option. Maybe you can draft a quarterback high in this year's draft. So that's the Derek Carr renegotiation. But again, I don't think they have another choice. And then
Can I jump in really quick before you go? So the Derek Carr thing is so fascinating to me because of a couple things. The age of Derek Carr, and I was looking at this, and it almost guarantees, if they restructure, that he would be the quarterback there for the next 2, most likely 3 seasons, I think, if they do the restructure. And that puts him at age 36 at the end of that. And like, there are just not that many top end NFL quarterbacks that play to 36, like, right? Like the best do, but Derek Carr is not in that tier. And so like you framed all this so well to say like, this is their option probably financially, but it's so dicey because he's going to be 36 years old at the end of that process. And likely their quarterback play is probably not improved that much. So it's a financial decision, but it's also an on-field thing that they have to evaluate and say, how do we navigate this? And it's just going to be interesting to see how they do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are some other restructures that I think the Saints really are going to have to, like, they're just going to be forced to do. That includes Taysom Hill, Demario Davis, Eric McCoy, Carl Granderson, and Cesar Ruiz. That will save them about $29.4 million. And then, you see they're at negative $1.8 million on the cap. Well, I'm not going to get into the gritty details of how they're going to get beyond that, because most teams probably want to get to about 15 million in the offseason. That's going to allow you to sign your draft class. And then in addition, have the money that you need to make minor transactions throughout the year, moving people from the practice squad and stuff. They can get there. It's cutting players like Kalen Saunders, John Ridgeway, etc. But what I'm saying is, okay, so you're going to restructure this bucket of players plus Derek Carr. Now, all of this money gets pushed into next year and 2026. So you're already starting those years off at a pretty big disadvantage. In addition, players like Derek Carr, Taysom Hill, Carl Granderson, Demario Davis, they're getting older and they're going to be less effective. Those are players you don't want to be paying a premium this late in their career. And Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, I don't think you have a problem pushing that money out in the future because these are really quality offensive linemen. So that's fine. Right. But the large majority of what you're doing, all of this dead cap that exists already, $30 million for Marcus Lattimore to not be on the team. These are things that are very, very problematic. And this is going forward, like, this is not re-signing any of your own free agents, and not signing any of other teams' free agents.
Yeah.
So this roster probably, I should have marked this down, but like we're talking like 35 players. So how are you going to get to 90 in the offseason? And like, yeah, only the top 53 count towards your actual salary cap, but this roster is going to be made up of so many rookies and undrafted free agents. The Rams had to do this a couple years ago, and they were actually pretty successful because they found a bunch of diamonds in the rough. They drafted really well. They got a few UDFAs that hit. They found a couple of street free agents that were like veteran minimums that played really well as well. But that is relying on a whole heck of a lot of luck to go your way. And like, yeah, this is a team that would be better off just taking a very hard reset, taking their medicine, and like dealing with a year or two of disaster. But there's literally no way for them to cut enough players to end up in the positive this offseason. So this is probably going to be a 2 to 3 year rebuild when they finally get around to doing the rebuild, which we're not even at this offseason because you're still pushing money out.
Yes. Yeah. That's the crazy thing. Like, clearly this rebuild in New Orleans is going to be painful. As Andrew mentioned, it might be best for them to just endure the pain, embrace and tear down now instead of trying to hold things together throughout this process. Going halfway is going to make it more painful for longer. It's amazing. Like I feel like, I know it hasn't been this way, but it feels like they've done this for a decade. And it probably hasn't been quite that long, but every single year we get to the offseason, we say, like, how are the Saints going to afford their players? And it's always, like Andrew said, it's like one credit card to pay for another. But we talk about like maybe the best plan is just to move on faster. But the Alvin Kamara deal doesn't really suggest that they see it that way, right? Like they're committing to an older star player, giving him the opportunity to retire a Saint, which is great for Kamara. But it could potentially hurt the team. And philosophically, it doesn't make a ton of sense. Andrew mentioned the players that are likely going to have to be gone by way of release, and that's going to be really difficult. But that doesn't even include, like he said, like players like Paulson Adebo, who could be future pieces of this young emerging team. They probably aren't going to be able to afford those guys. Like those guys are going to go find new teams. So it doesn't account for other possibilities like Chris Olave, who may not want to stick around and be a part of the long term here. Obviously, some of those things are out of his control, and he has injuries now that complicate those things, but he may want a trade or at least make things interesting for that front office if he's insisting on one, right? So this is a tough situation, and it's tempting to try to keep the organization and the roster together with duct tape because the NFC South is bad, right? It's not competitive. So maybe they think like maybe we can pull things together and, do those things. But man, I don't know. Andrew, if you're the GM for this team, we've laid the groundwork here for how this is a difficult situation. But our goal in like this podcast isn't just to like bash on the Saints. It's roster building, right? So like what is the best path here? What hope could Saints fans have to lean into as they do kind of like look to the future and look at like a potential rebuild?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's scary is like, who are you going to hire as your coach? Because potentially you're signing up for a year or two runway of a team that's like maybe maxed out at this point, on the decline, going to be very thin depth-wise. And then you might be the scapegoat when they have to like just tear the thing completely to the ground.
Yes.
So I don't think you're going to get like one of the top coordinators that are out there. They may have to go the route. We saw the Texans do it for a year. I think it was David Tully, maybe was the name of the coach. I don't even remember, but it was basically just like the sacrificial coach of like, you were going to be terrible for a year, but you can put being a head coach on your resume. We saw a couple of transitional kind of positions. The 49ers did this one year. Like you might have to do that kind of thing, get like like somebody who's been around forever that just never got that chance. Maybe they want Chris Gizzy, who's their interim right now, a longtime special teams coordinator, somebody that's sort of been sniffing around the head coaching ranks. Maybe you give him a shot for a year or two. I think that makes me very nervous if I'm a Saints fan, because we just saw what the Dennis Allen situation was, and that wasn't particularly good.
Right.
So a head coach is the first thing you got to figure out. Maybe you find like you're like, who could potentially be the next Sean McVay and like we're gonna hire a 30-year-old quarterback coach from somewhere to like really be an innovator, and then we'll surround him with some older coordinators. But I think like from a roster standpoint, let's say they do all of the theoretical things that I said. Well, this offensive line is going to be pretty thin. They still have some good pieces there. You could say, okay, that's a positive. We like our tight end room. Juwan Johnson, Taysom Hill, that's fine. Chris Olave, major question mark, right? Concussion issues. You have Rashid Shaheed coming off of a major knee injury. You have Alvin Kamara aging. You're probably not going to have a lot of depth behind him. Kendra Miller has never been healthy. Derek Carr is a big question mark. On defense, like, you're so old. Like, Demario Davis still a fantastic player. Old. Tyrann Mathieu still old.
I can't believe he's still in the league, actually.
Yeah, like eventually Cameron Jordan, like he's gonna realize that he's old. And so like these aren't players that you can necessarily rely on. The young players haven't necessarily stepped up, and you're gonna have to replace them through the draft. So maybe if you really like you have a fantastic draft class and you find like a few veteran minimum free agents that you just luck into being pretty good contributors, maybe you can be a solid team. But what's the ceiling of that? It's not a Super Bowl contender.
No. I think that the temptation is that the NFC South is very winnable, right? Like, so maybe you think that like you can pull that off, but yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting. What does ownership want? What can they convince a head coach to do? What head coach can they convince to come in? And I think I'm with you that this is like a retread head coach opportunity. Somebody who says, I'm not getting another job, but maybe I pull off a miracle and I win the NFC South. And, that's the opportunity. Like, they're not going to get somebody to come in, like you said, and like be the next expected up and coming coach is probably not taking this job. So
Ben Johnson's not sniffing.
Not taking that job. No,
he's not even taking the interview.
No, this is it's just going to be interesting to see what they do. And I guess if it's going to be hard because so much of this team is going to be old, and the Derek Carr piece, that's the one that's like, is there a way that they figure out to say it's going to hurt like heck, but we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off and we're going to figure out a way to go in a different direction at quarterback? Because Derek Carr's fine, but like, he's old, and that's not going to get you to where you're going to go next. The rest of the hope here, I think, is in committing to a long-term plan through the draft, changing the way that you've done your finances for a decade plus, and saying like, okay, this is a team that has a first-round pick and a second-round pick next year in 2025, but they also have 2 third-round picks, they have 2 fourth-round picks, and they have 2 sixth-round picks, okay? The key to this team probably fixing their path is probably committing to that process of draft and develop and get cheap talent, because otherwise they can't do it in free agency, and they're going to have to start replacing some of that aging talent. So I guess if you're a Saints fan, the hope here is that they commit to a plan early and they get everybody on the same page, from ownership to coaching to veteran players, and then they hit on some of these draft picks, and then they maybe save themselves a little bit of pain in the process. But it is going to be an interesting road for the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, and I was just trying to take a look at Derek Carr's contract, and I'm not seeing a definitive answer here. They'd be facing something like a $60 million dead cap hit.
Huge.
So to spread that out as a post June 1st cut would be fine. But the fact is, like, they can't get under that negative $77 million without restructuring his deal. So it's sort of like you have to do that in order to make the other moves. And then if you're going to keep Derek Carr around, well, you know you're going to be mediocre anyways. So why not just bring back the better mediocre players? I guess. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Gonna be fun. I don't know. And if you're a Saints fan, I mean, this is why you're a Saints fan, right? Like, you're gonna go through the good years, and then you're gonna go through the lean years, and it looks like it's gonna be 2 or 3. But hopefully, if you're also a draft fan, that this will be some fun for you as you get to see them bring in some of those new building blocks and they build for the future.
Yeah. So you want to wrap things up?
Is that my job in the show? Should I do that?
Yeah, a little bit.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. We've had a great conversation about the New Orleans Saints. Make sure you do like and subscribe to the show, and we will be back next week with more draft content as we look into 2025. But from the draft room to the gridiron, the Draft Fellows have got you covered. Until next time, stay tuned and stay in the game.
Kyle got the insight, Andrew brings the heat. Breaking down the roster every single week. Catch us on the podcast, we coming through your speakers. Top picks for practice squad, we got the seekers. Team dynamics, contracts, and the trades. From the draft day excitement to the accolades. Draft fellows on the track, we gone strong. Analyze the plays, we can't be wrong. From the 40-yard dash to the longest throw. We talking pro ball.